It started with a number, just one line buried in a government report. But when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into that hearing room, she didn't just bring a binder, she brought a reckoning. With cameras rolling and the nation watching, she dropped it like a thunderclap. $7 trillion in global subsidies for fossil fuels, while working families are told to tighten their belts. Chris Wright, the energy secretary, tried to deflect, reframe, redefine, but it was too late. His words buckled under the weight of the truth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The data spoke louder than any speech. And when she turned the spotlight onto the immigrant workers powering his industry, then cornered him with one simple question he couldn't answer, the room fell silent. This isn't just a political clash. It's a story about who pays the price when power hides behind paperwork. Though dramatized for narrative impact, every moment here is inspired by real tensions, real hearings, and real people. The names are true, the setting is fictionalized, but the emotional truth, that part's all real. Because sometimes what breaks in Washington isn't just policy, it's the illusion that no one is paying attention. Let's begin. The room was cold in that way only federal buildings could be. Polished marble, too much fluorescent light, and the kind of silence that didn't invite calm but warned of something waiting. A ticking clock, a humming camera, the quiet cough of a staffer trying to clear tension from their throat. All of it holding its breath. Then came the sound. Bang! The gavel struck wood. Today's hearing will now come to order. Cameras blinked awake. Microphones flared red. Somewhere, a live stream timer started counting. Chris Wright, newly confirmed Secretary of Energy, adjusted his cufflink with an ease too practiced to be innocent. His tie was just slightly off-center, strategically, his team thought, to seem relatable. He smiled for the cameras, rehearsed, regulated, completely unaware that the most powerful 5 minutes of his career were already ticking down. He wasn't worried, not really. His prep team had briefed him. Expect a few heated questions from Ocasio-Cortez, but nothing you can't handle. The plan was to stay vague, invoke market dynamics, and maybe even offer a clever line about balancing the grid. But plans tend to melt under pressure. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from New York's 14th district, the moderator said. A quiet stir in the room, then the sound of paper sliding softly against a leather folder. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't rise quickly. She rose deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world and no intention of wasting any of it. She didn't look angry. That would have been too easy to dismiss. She looked exact, like someone who had studied not just data, but human tells. Her suit was navy, unflinching, her hair tied back in a way that made every word feel sharper. And in her hand, a binder so full it barely closed, held together by 3 thick rubber bands and a brass clip like a promise. She sat down, flicked a tab open, and spoke without looking up. "Mr. Secretary," she said, voice steady, low, conversational. "Before I dive into my questions, I just want to clarify something I believe may have been misunderstood." Wright nodded, amused. "Of course. Go right ahead." It was his last moment of comfort. "You've confirmed that renewable energy receives public subsidies," AOC continued. "But just to be clear, you're not suggesting fossil fuels don't receive any subsidies, are you?" Wright chuckled. That sound, light, dismissive, almost condescending, floated into the microphone like a trapdoor creaking open. "Well, not in any meaningful way," he said. "It's complicated. A matter of definitions, really." That word. Definitions. The temperature in the room dropped, or maybe it only felt that way. AOC finally looked up. She didn't blink. "No meaningful subsidies," she repeated, slow. "That's your position?" Wright offered a politician's shrug, the kind designed to look honest while admitting nothing. "There's always room for interpretation, Congresswoman. It's not as black and white as people think." But AOC wasn't playing chess. She was flipping the board. She reached into the binder, not quickly but with precision, and pulled out a sheet already highlighted. She didn't wave it around. She didn't even raise her voice. She just read, "In 2022 alone, fossil fuel companies in the United States received between $10 and $52 billion in direct subsidies. Globally, between 1.5 and $7 trillion. That's not interpretation, Mr. Secretary. That's the math. Cameras zoomed, lenses tightened. Chris Wright blinked for the first time. And still, AOC wasn't finished. Would you like to revise your statement before we proceed? The air turned surgical. Someone in the back coughed, and no one else moved. Wright smiled again, this time tighter. He looked down at the table, not at her, not at the paper. And for just a second, he looked like a man realizing he was standing in a room where everything he thought was hidden was suddenly visible. She had more. Everyone could feel it, and she hadn't even raised her voice. She didn't blink when she said it, just held the paper, steady in her hand, and let the figures do what they were meant to do, land like bricks on a glass table. $10 to $52 billion in direct subsidies to fossil fuels in 2022 alone, she repeated, her voice calm, crisp, undeniable. And globally, $1.5 to $7 trillion. With a T, she didn't need to explain the gravity of that number. The hearing room, suddenly silent, but for the quiet hum of equipment, did it for her. Chris Wright shifted in his seat. It was small but noticeable. A subtle realignment of posture, the kind of thing people do when the temperature changes or when a question hits closer than expected. He reached for his water, took a sip that looked more like a delay than thirst, and replied with the reflex of a man trained in soft deflection. Congresswoman, as I said, I believe there's a fair amount of debate on what constitutes a subsidy. AOC raised an eyebrow, not out of surprise but recognition. There it was, the strategy. Start with the terms, blur the definitions, and muddy the water until no one can swim through it. She leaned forward, not in aggression, but with the precision of someone laying a cornerstone. So let's break that down together, she offered almost kindly, because when the federal government leases public land to oil companies for pennies on the dollar, and those same companies extract billions in profit from that land without returning anything close to its value, is that not a public gift to a private industry? No answer. Wright adjusted his tie. She continued, when those same companies are allowed tax breaks, depreciation write-offs, and royalty exemptions so generous they amount to billions, when the state absorbs their environmental risks and the military protects their overseas interests, is that not public spending for private gain? Still no answer. Let me put it another way, she said, flipping to a new page in her binder. Her tone shifted, still calm but edged now with something firmer. If a person walked into a government office and got a $300 million loan forgiven, had their rent slashed by 98%, and were given a security detail for free, would we hesitate to call that a subsidy? A small ripple of motion ran through the gallery, people shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. But when oil companies, among the most profitable corporations on earth, receive those same benefits, suddenly it's not a subsidy? She looked directly at Wright. It's a partnership, a free market, a patriotic investment? Chris Wright opened his mouth, closed it again. She let the silence grow. The average American doesn't get to drill into public land for the cost of a sandwich. But ExxonMobil can, she added. And that's not a metaphor. In some leases, the cost is literally less than a lunch. So help me understand, what do we call that, if not government support? Wright cleared his throat, his voice lower now. Well, Congresswoman, many of these policies have historical context. They're long-standing structures meant to stabilize energy production. AOC nodded, as if he had confirmed exactly what she needed. Long-standing structures, built for a world that no longer exists, and still funded by people who are told we can't afford clean energy, or health care, or school lunches. Her gaze locked on him again. But we can't afford this? He tried to speak again, but the weight of the numbers had shifted the room. What began as a hearing was becoming something else. A reckoning not just about fossil fuels, but about the narratives that protect them. And AOC, without ever raising her voice, had already rewritten the script. Let's keep going, she said, flipping to the next section, because I haven't even touched immigration yet. And just like that, the temperature dropped again. She didn't ask it like an accusation. She asked it like a principle that no one should struggle to name. A simple sentence, yet it sliced through the committee room with surgical precision. Is that not public funding? Wright didn't answer at first. Not because he couldn't, but because he was calculating how much truth he could afford to acknowledge without unraveling everything else. He glanced toward the chairman, then back at AOC, but she wasn't blinking. She wasn't posturing. She was waiting, and that was far more dangerous. The room had grown noticeably still. Behind the raised wood paneling and polished microphones, there were aides who stopped typing. Staffers from both parties leaned forward, just slightly. The air had that unmistakable density, the kind that only shows up when someone says something that can't be put back in the box. Wright cleared his throat, stalling. Well, Congresswoman, again, I'd just say that many of these measures aren't direct cash payments. AOC cut in. Not loudly, not rudely, just with timing so perfect it sounded like punctuation. But they are public resources, leases on federal land, reduced royalties, accelerated depreciation deductions, strategic reserves guarded by military infrastructure. Do those not come from the taxpayer? He opened his hands slightly, the universal gesture of, well, yes, but also no. I think it depends on how you define benefit. The industry pays fees, rents, taxes. She leaned back just enough to create space, then leaned forward again. They pay pennies, Mr. Secretary, and in return they extract billions. The land is public. The roads they use are public. The cleanup, when it happens, is publicly funded. The costs of climate impact, borne by the public. So I'll ask again, in plain terms, is that not public funding? Wright reached for his water again. This time the sip was longer, slower. Not because he was thirsty, but because his playbook didn't have a page for this. He had expected ideology. What he got was arithmetic. The microphones glowed a quiet red. The CSPAN chyron sat unmoving at the bottom of the screen. House Committee on Energy and Oversight. Live. Somewhere, someone was clipping this moment. AOC didn't need to go viral. The truth was doing that work for her. I think, Wright began slowly, I think there's a spectrum of what people view as public funding. I'd hesitate to apply that term too broadly, or we risk acknowledging how much this industry has relied on public generosity. She finished for him, but again without raising her voice. Yes, that's the risk. He paused, smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. With all respect, Congresswoman, energy independence has national value. It requires public-private partnership. True, she replied, but a partnership implies parity. What we're describing is dependency. The fossil fuel industry is not just coexisting with the public trust, it's profiting from it, vastly, quietly, repeatedly. Wright's jaw tensed, and then came the moment no one could mistake. He looked down, not at his notes, not at her, but down at the polished desk in front of him, as if somewhere beneath the wood grain he might find an answer that wasn't there when he walked in. That was the first fracture. It wasn't a shouted takedown. It wasn't a mic drop moment or a viral clapback. It was quieter than that. It was the moment a man realized the logic he'd been trained to repeat was no longer holding under pressure. And it wasn't just the room that noticed. It was the thousands watching from home, the energy workers flipping through channels, the policy students on livestream, the voters who didn't always follow hearings, but stayed when they could tell something real was happening, because the mic was still on. And this time, so was the truth. Chris Wright had been briefed, repeatedly. The night before the hearing, his top advisor leaned across a walnut conference table and said the same line twice. She's not here to banter, she's here to land punches, and she'll come armed. He'd nodded, as if that warning surprised him. It didn't. He'd seen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in hearings before. Everyone had. She had a reputation. The rare politician who could layer data with conviction, keep her tone steady, and still make a grown man sweat in a room full of cameras. But Wright wasn't worried, not entirely, because he had a strategy of his own. They had rehearsed it like a play. If she brought up subsidies, he'd use the word complicated. If she cornered him on leases, he'd pivot to energy independence. If she cited global figures, he'd question the methodology. Semantic warfare. It didn't win arguments, but it bought time. The trick wasn't to win, just to survive the 5-minute round. Let the clock run. Stay vague. Stay polite. Call everything a framework. He'd used the playbook before. In a Senate hearing 3 months earlier, when pressed about methane leaks from offshore platforms, he'd leaned into ambiguity. The data is still evolving, he'd said. We're in consultation with multiple stakeholders. No one followed up. At a House subcommittee meeting, when asked about enforcement gaps in coal ash regulation, he'd smiled and said, "The situation is fluid." That was the phrase that killed the story. Wright believed in the long game, not the policy, but the optics. A successful hearing to him was one where nothing stuck, where the headlines focused on tone, not content, where no clip went viral. That's what made this moment different, because it wasn't just what AOC was asking, it was how she was asking it. She didn't frame her question like a gotcha. She framed it like a citizen asking where her tax dollars went. And that made it harder to swat away. He remembered the way she looked when she said, "Is that not public funding?" How her voice didn't rise, how she didn't fumble for stats or trip over acronyms. She said it like she'd said it 100 times in her mind already. And maybe she had. He glanced at his prepared notes, 3 typed pages with color-coded flags and phrases like incentive structures, capital risk sharing, interagency alignment. None of them fit anymore. They weren't built for this kind of pressure. Somewhere in the back of his mind, an earlier memory surfaced. The first time he testified as a deputy assistant undersecretary, years ago, before the title meant anything. A different chairwoman then, slow and ceremonial, asking about refinery permits. He had stumbled but recovered with jargon. That was when he first realized, the more abstract you sound, the less likely anyone is to dig deeper. Ambiguity was insulation. But insulation doesn't hold when the heat comes from direct current, and AOC was all voltage. Methodical, relentless, and unnervingly human. He blinked. The clock on the wall behind the chair read 10:18. Still early? Too early to be sweating. But he could feel it, beneath his collar, under his watch band. She hadn't raised her voice once, and yet the room already felt different. He reached for the strategy again, tried to form a sentence that would blur the edges of her logic. Something safe, something familiar. "Congresswoman, as I've said, it's not a simple black and white." But even as he spoke, he knew it was slipping. The playbook was open. The phrases were ready. But she wasn't playing by the rules anymore. And worse, everyone could see it. She kept her gaze fixed. Not aggressive, not icy, just impossibly still. The kind of gaze that doesn't search for permission or applause, but for accountability. Chris Wright glanced away first. He tried to hold it, but he couldn't. She was already flipping to the next page in her binder, her fingers landing precisely on the line she needed. "I'd like to read to you from the 2022 Energy Department Appropriations Summary," she said, voice calm, almost gentle. "Section 4, page 11, footnote 2, federal subsidies for fossil fuel exploration, extraction, and production, including tax deferrals, leasing discounts, and infrastructure guarantees, shall remain in place through 2026 unless revised by congressional authority." She looked up again. "That's your department's own language. It doesn't say gray area. It doesn't say market incentive. It says subsidy." Wright gave a faint, tight smile, the kind that belongs more to muscle memory than conviction. But AOC wasn't waiting for his agreement. She moved on. "Now let's compare that," she continued, flipping a tab with a small red sticker, "to the renewable energy section, solar credits, wind infrastructure, green battery incentives, every single one tied to expiration dates, performance caps, and clawback clauses." Her voice never rose, but her cadence had changed. Sharper now, measured. When clean energy gets help, it's under a microscope. When fossil fuel gets help, it's built into the floorboards. The room didn't shift, but the people watching did. A junior staffer from Oregon whispered to his colleague, "She's going in." Someone from press in the back row checked their phone and opened Twitter. A few seats down, a climate nonprofit's intern typed furiously, "AOC reading from DOE Budget Live." This is surgical, but inside the hearing room, AOC's tone was unchanged. Unmoved, she drew a line in the air with her pen, as if sketching it out for a classroom. "Let me explain it this way," she said. "Clean energy is treated like a college student, on probation, constantly proving it deserves to be here. Fossil fuel, treated like a legacy trust fund kid who never has to show receipts." Chris Wright let out the faintest chuckle, then stopped himself. She didn't flinch. "You may find the metaphor amusing, Mr. Secretary, but to the millions of Americans paying rising energy bills while funding corporate extraction, it's not funny. It's their money, their air, their future." Wright opened his mouth, then closed it again. She let the moment hang, just long enough. Outside the room, clips began to spread. 30 seconds here, a quote graphic there. On Instagram, one user posted a screenshot with the caption, "She didn't blink once." On Reddit, the thread was already trending. AOC breaks down subsidies like it's Econ 101 and still roasts the fossil fuel lobby. But inside the room, none of that was visible. What mattered was the silence, not the kind that precedes chaos, but the kind that follows clarity. AOC flipped to her next tab, pale yellow this time. She looked up, gaze steady, and said with quiet finality, "So again, Mr. Secretary, when fossil fuels are guaranteed billions with no expiration and renewables are rationed through performance-based trials, do you still believe the playing field is level?" Wright shifted, the paper in front of him untouched. And still, she didn't blink. It happened fast, but not so fast that people missed it. Chris Wright leaned slightly forward, his hand resting on the table as if steadying himself for a swing. His voice, which had been composed and cordial until now, took on a faint edge, not sharp, but brittle. "Well, Congresswoman," he began, "it's important to note that the actual figure for U.S. fossil fuel subsidies is closer to $4 billion annually, not the $52 billion you referenced." A few heads turned, some eyebrows lifted. It was the kind of moment you could miss if you weren't listening closely. But AOC was listening. She didn't react, not with her face. No smirk, no scowl, just a slow, deliberate movement. She folded the sheet in her hand, gently, with the care of someone tucking away evidence until it was needed again. "Mr. Secretary," she said, not breaking eye contact, "the figure I cited was from your department's own report, which placed the range between $10 billion and $52 billion, depending on scope and inclusions, such as tax expenditures, leasing discounts, and environmental costs not recovered." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You just quoted a number that represents only direct payments, excluding the bulk of indirect supports. That's not the full picture." She let that sentence land without rushing. Wright blinked just once and glanced down again. His fingers tapped against the tabletop. 3 slow taps, then a pause. The kind of small habit people don't know they're doing until they're caught in a moment they hadn't rehearsed for. In the gallery, someone scribbled a note. A reporter checking quotes looked up, then back down at their transcript. Online, live stream comments began to scroll faster. "She caught him. Fact check in real time. This is wild." Wright shifted in his seat. "I believe the $4 billion figure comes from a more focused review. One more in line with industry-recognized calculations." AOC raised one hand slightly, almost like she was giving space for him to finish, but she didn't interrupt. She just waited until he fell silent. Then, with a softness so measured it became unmistakable, she asked, "Would you like to correct that for the record?" The words landed like a velvet hammer, not accusatory, not performative, just direct, inevitable. The kind of question that doesn't leave bruises, but leaves no escape. Wright inhaled, not deeply, but carefully. He straightened in his chair, forced a smile, and tried to slide sideways. "Well, I'd be happy to revisit the numbers later in written form to ensure accuracy." AOC nodded once, slow. "That would be wise." She flipped the folded paper back open and tucked it neatly behind the next tab. Then she folded her hands and waited, silent, patient, still. Wright said nothing more, and that was when the shift became visible, even to those who didn't understand energy policy. His confidence had slipped, not dramatically, not in collapse, but like a building where the foundation gave just a little. Enough to feel it, enough to make people wonder what else might shake loose. The rest of the room felt it too, not as tension, but as imbalance. Something subtle had inverted. She was no longer asking for answers. She was issuing reminders of the facts, of the framing, of the quiet math behind loud industries. For Wright, the strategy had always been to outlast, to deflect until time expired. But now time wasn't the problem. It was presence. She was still there, still steady, still folding and unfolding pages like chapters in a book he hadn't read. And all he could do was wait for the next question. There was a pause, but not the kind that signaled the end of a line of questioning. It was the kind that meant the page was about to turn. AOC took a slow breath, her hand resting on the corner of her binder, and said calmly, "Let's talk about the hands behind your industry." Chris Wright looked up, his brows lifted slightly, unsure of where she was headed. The phrasing wasn't technical, it wasn't budgetary, it was human, and that made it unpredictable. AOC flipped to a green tab and drew out a single piece of paper. Not a budget chart, not a policy draft, but a letter. The edges were creased, folded 3 times over. It had clearly been opened, read, and reread. She didn't introduce it with flair. She just said, "This was sent to my office 2 weeks ago from a man named Jose Alvarado, a temporary protected status holder working on a pipeline in Oklahoma." She unfolded it gently, smoothing it with her palm before reading. He writes, "Congresswoman, I have been in this country since 2003. I work 12-hour shifts laying pipeline in the summer heat and the winter freeze. I pay taxes, I don't take public benefits, and I show up every morning before the sun. My TPS allows me to live with dignity, to work legally, but now they say it might end. If I lose that, I lose my job, and the company loses a man who knows every inch of that pipeline like the lines in his hand." The words hung in the air, not dramatic but honest, the kind of truth that didn't need amplification. Wright shifted again in his seat. She could tell he was uncomfortable, not because he disagreed, but because the ground had moved. He had prepared for charts, not for names, not for stories like Jose's. "I'd like to know, Mr. Secretary," she continued, "do you believe that people like Jose, documented tax-paying workers with TPS status, should lose their right to work in this country while continuing to power its infrastructure?" Wright hesitated. This wasn't a policy line he had memorized. It wasn't part of the energy brief. He stammered slightly. I'm not involved in immigration enforcement or the decision-making process on TPS. I'm not sure I'm qualified to comment." "But you are qualified," she said softly, "because when a sector relies on labor like Jose's and your department builds plans around their work, then your silence becomes a position." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no performative pause, just the plain reality that a man in charge of the nation's energy infrastructure was being asked to reckon with the people who actually held the wrenches and torches. And he wasn't ready. "You may not write immigration policy," she added, "but you benefit from it. You inherit the labor it protects, and if it disappears, so does your workforce." Wright opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing procedural to grab hold of, no framework to hide behind. AOC had turned the lens away from subsidies and toward the workers whose names never made it into the footnotes. "In your last 3 hearings," she continued, flipping briefly through a log, "you referenced labor shortages as a national concern. And yet, when asked about the legal status of the very people filling that gap, you defer." She paused. "So let me ask again. Do you support ending work authorization for TPS holders like Jose?" Wright looked toward the chair, then back at her. "Congresswoman, I'd have to follow up. I don't want to speak out of turn." AOC nodded once, slowly. "Thank you. I'll note for the record that the question remains unanswered." And that was the shift. Not loud, not sweeping, but exact. In less than 3 minutes, she had moved the hearing from numbers to names, from cost to consequence. And suddenly the policies weren't abstract anymore. They had fingerprints. And the nation watching now had a face to remember. There was no change in her tone when she asked it. No dramatic lead-in. No raised volume. Just a question delivered so plainly that it pierced through the layers of formality like a pin to glass. "Do you support ending their work permits?" Chris Wright sat still for a beat too long. It was the kind of pause that exposed not just hesitation, but unfamiliarity. the uncomfortable recognition that this part of the map was blank. He cleared his throat, buying time, and finally answered with a shaky half-smile. I'm not familiar with that specific provision, Congresswoman. I'd need to see more detail before commenting on that particular policy. AOC didn't blink, didn't sigh, didn't glance around for validation. She leaned forward just slightly, not to intimidate, but to sharpen the focus. Her words came quieter now, but each syllable landed with a precision honed by hours of listening to stories like Jose's. But you lead the department they power. Wright looked at her, then away, then back again. His lips parted, then shut. There was no easy response to that, not because he didn't have talking points, but because none of them applied to the terrain she had just pulled him into. She wasn't asking about line items or tariffs. She was asking about people. And in this space, evasion looked like indifference. They don't work for you on paper, she continued, but they're there, on the rigs in the fields, maintaining turbines, welding pipelines. They're the ones who climb at dawn and stay when storms roll in. They're the ones whose legal status is now being questioned by the very system they uphold with their labor. He shifted again. Respectfully, Congresswoman, immigration status and workforce regulations fall under DHS and labor, not DOE. I'm not trying to sidestep the concern. I just want to stay within my scope. She raised one eyebrow slightly. Scope, she repeated. Mr. Secretary, I'd argue that when the fuel you promise Americans is delivered through the backs of workers you refuse to defend, that is your scope. She didn't need to gesture. The words did the motion for her. In the second row behind her, a young staffer typed furiously, capturing every word. Online, the live stream lit up again. A labor organizer in Texas tweeted, "She just said what every energy worker's been screaming into the void." A congressional reporter noted simply, AOC shifts the hearing's moral center. AOC let the silence stretch just enough to make the discomfort productive. Then she added, you say you're passionate about energy policy. Then let's be clear. Policy is not just prices and production. It's who we decide is worth protecting. Wright's fingers tapped twice on the table, then stopped. I appreciate the concern, and I don't want to diminish it. But again, I'll need to follow up. She cut in, not sharply but finally. Mr. Secretary, no one's asking you to draft immigration law on this dais. I'm asking if you believe that men and women who have shown up, legally, for decades, should be allowed to keep showing up. That's not legislation, that's leadership. For a moment, the weight of the question settled like dust. Not loud, not rhetorical, just real. And in his silence, the answer echoed louder than any confirmation could have. He wasn't ready. Not for this question, not for this witness, and America was listening. Silence settled over the hearing room like fog, slow, steady, and inescapable. Not a comfortable pause, not a break between points, but the kind of silence that made even still air feel heavier. It was the sound of reckoning, not a verdict, but the moment before it. Chris Wright's fingers hovered above the page in front of him, blank, though covered in typed words, his pen untouched, his tie slightly askew, his breath visible only in the stillness between questions. He glanced toward the committee chair, then back toward AOC, but no relief came from either direction. No procedural bailout, no buffer zone. In the public gallery, bodies shifted. A man in a flannel jacket crossed his arms a little tighter. A woman in a maintenance uniform, her badge barely visible, folded a tissue and gripped it with both hands. Someone in the back coughed quietly, a sound too human to ignore. No one spoke. No one dared to break what had formed here. The truth, crystallizing in real time. AOC didn't smile. There was no smirk of satisfaction, no show of triumph. Just a stillness matching the rooms. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't reach for another tab in her binder. She didn't need to. The most powerful arguments often come not in repetition, but in restraint. She looked directly at Wright and spoke with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed not in mirrors or prep sessions, but in listening to people whose names would never make it into policy documents. If you don't know who's working the fields, she said, voice even and low, maybe you shouldn't be planting policy. No one moved. No one dared. It wasn't just a line. It was a boundary drawn. Not just between AOC and the man before her, but between those who claim authority and those who live its consequences. The words echoed in the room not as a question, but as a final offer of reflection. A reminder that knowing the system isn't the same as understanding the people holding it up. Wright opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out. Not because he didn't have the vocabulary, but because the words he'd brought to this hearing no longer fit the moment he was in. In that quiet, even the walls seemed to listen. And outside the chamber, something began to spread. A clip of her words hit Twitter within minutes, posted by a staffer in the back row. The caption read, "Ocasio-Cortez just delivered the line of the year. Watch this." Within an hour, it would trend. But inside that room, there were no algorithms, just air and silence, and the sound of one man realizing that the ground he thought was firm had been soft all along, and one woman, unwavering, refusing to look away. The chair finally shifted, papers rustled, someone cleared a throat, but no one quite spoke. The hearing would continue, but everyone knew the moment had already arrived and passed. As AOC gently closed her binder and set her hands on the desk in front of her, she didn't look around to gauge reaction. She didn't need confirmation. She already had what she came for. Not a confession, but something deeper. The truth made visible through refusal. The exposure not of corruption, but of disconnect. The kind of exposure that doesn't demand rage, but reflection. And in that stillness, as she sat back in her chair, the entire room exhaled. Quietly, carefully, as if it knew something irreversible had just happened. The room was just beginning to recover its rhythm when AOC leaned slightly forward and turned a fresh page in her binder. The motion was quiet but purposeful, like a musician flipping to the next verse, one the audience didn't know was coming. Her voice, when it returned, was just as calm, but there was an edge in the cadence now, a precision that signaled a shift. This wasn't a follow-up, it was a pivot with teeth. "Mr. Secretary," she began, "I'd like to revisit a comment you made in your February interview with Bloomberg Energy Weekly." She didn't wait for permission, didn't ask if he remembered. She simply read, "Lower oil prices are better. There are far more consumers than producers, and I don't think American consumers should worry about the stock prices of oil companies." She looked up. "You stand by that statement, correct?" Wright nodded cautiously. "In general, yes. Lower prices benefit the majority of Americans." "Great," she said without pause. "Then help me understand something. Steel tariffs, currently at 50% on certain imports. Steel, as you know, is a foundational input in oil and gas infrastructure. Pipelines, refineries, rigs, transport. So here's my question, Mr. Secretary. How does raising steel cost lower oil prices?" The question landed like a trapdoor slamming shut. Wright blinked. "Well," he started, that's a multifaceted issue. Tariffs are part of the administration's broader strategy to—" She didn't interrupt, but she didn't let the moment slip either. "Yes," she said gently, "a strategy that includes reshoring industry. But the numbers, Mr. Secretary, let's stay there for a second. Domestic producers now report up to 30% increases in materials costs. A March survey from the Dallas Fed noted steel costs as the #1 inflationary pressure cited by oil and gas firms. Did your department account for those cost increases in your production models?" Wright exhaled through his nose, a breath that wanted to be a sigh. "We're monitoring those shifts, but the long-term strategy is about national strength, manufacturing independence, especially for critical materials." AOC nodded, slow and deliberate. "I understand. I'm just trying to reconcile something for the American public. On one hand, you say oil prices should be lower, because that helps consumers. On the other, your policies you've publicly supported, directly raise the cost of producing that oil." She paused. "Is the idea that producers will simply absorb the costs, or is it more likely that those costs get passed on to the same consumers you say you're protecting?" Wright adjusted his posture. "There's always a balancing effect. The market responds dynamically. In time, reshoring will reduce dependency and bring long-term savings. But the bills people get this month," she pressed, "don't arrive in the long term. They arrive now." For the first time, Wright's voice lifted, not in anger, but in defense. Congresswoman, energy policy is a matrix of competing pressures. It's not always linear. No, she agreed, her voice level. But math usually is. You raise input costs, the final product doesn't get cheaper. It gets harder to afford. He looked down at the papers in front of him again, suddenly less a witness and more a man checking his footing on uneven ground. His previous confidence, the crisp phrasing, the breezy references to economic flexibility, now seemed thinner in the air. AOC sat back slightly in her chair, but didn't look away. It's one thing to make complex decisions. It's another to pretend they're simple when they're convenient, then call them complicated when they're questioned. The gallery didn't stir, but the silence sharpened again. Online, the clips were already forming, her voice overlaid on bar graphs, headlines referencing tariff trap, policy whiplash, energy doublespeak. But in the room, she stayed anchored. I'm not here to simplify your job, Mr. Secretary. I'm here to clarify its impact. And with that, she flipped to the next tab. Steel gray, appropriately. Chris Wright shifted again in his chair, this time with more intention. His expression tightened, not in anger but in calculation. He was retracing his own logic, step by step, trying to rebuild ground that had just eroded. Congresswoman, he began, I understand the concern, but tariffs are part of a broader effort to bring back domestic manufacturing. We've outsourced too much for too long. Reshoring steel production is about national security and economic resilience. The phrase was practiced, almost polished. National security, economic resilience. Big ideas that sounded noble and unassailable, and usually made people back off. But AOC didn't. She let him finish, nodding slightly as if she were waiting for him to land the plane, then calmly laid the tarmac on fire. Sure, she said, but at what cost? He blinked. She didn't let the silence linger. Have you read the Dallas Fed's March survey? She asked, already reaching for the report in her binder. Because I have. She held it up, not theatrically but visibly, like a textbook open to a page no one expected would be assigned. Dozens of oil and gas company CEOs were surveyed about business conditions. You know what showed up again and again? She tapped the page. Steel tariffs, supply chain bottlenecks, materials inflation, not ideology, not regulation. Steel Wright adjusted his glasses. I haven't read that particular report in full, he said, tone tightening. She flipped to a flagged section. Then allow me, quoting from respondent #36, the increase in steel tariffs has directly raised wellhead infrastructure costs. We've delayed projects and downsized teams as a result. Another page turn. Respondent #14. If the administration wants domestic production to rise, it needs to reduce cost barriers, not raise them. She paused just long enough for the words to sink in. Then she looked up and asked, do you consider those CEOs part of your stakeholder base? Wright hesitated. Well, yes, of course, but each company faces different conditions. Some might… Right, AOC interrupted, still calm. But if your defense of tariffs is that they'll lower long-term dependency, and your stakeholders are telling you it's choking short-term production, then shouldn't you at least acknowledge that contradiction? Wright opened his hand slightly. Tariffs take time to work. We can't expect full reshoring effects overnight. True, she said, but American families don't live overnight. They live month to month, week to week. If they can't afford gas this quarter, they don't care what the industrial base looks like in 2035. He inhaled through his nose and exhaled slowly, but not confidently. And let's be clear, she added, I'm not anti-industry, I'm anti-fantasy. You don't get cheaper oil by making the tools to extract it more expensive. You don't revive American manufacturing by ignoring its front lines. You want to bring back steel? Fine. Just don't pretend the pain in the meantime isn't real and isn't being passed on. Wright sat back slightly, trying to hide the motion. His face was composed, but his grip on the talking points had loosened. What had started as a firm stance now read more like evasion in slow reverse. In the gallery, the note-taking paused. People were watching, yes, but they were also understanding. This wasn't just policy now. It was the economics of everyday life. The price of gas, the delays in construction, the layoffs. It was math wearing steel-toe boots. AOC placed the Dallas Fed report gently back into her binder. "We can debate long-term strategy another day," she said. "Today I'm asking about reality, and reality doesn't wait for reshoring." Wright said nothing. She didn't press. She didn't need to, because the backpedal had already begun, and the public was watching every step. The chair glanced down at the timer, flicked his pen against the wooden surface, and cleared his throat. "The gentle lady's time has expired," he said in a tone meant to be neutral, but it landed in the room like a rescue signal. Chris Wright, who hadn't spoken in nearly a full minute, turned slightly toward the chair, as if permission had finally been granted to breathe again. But AOC didn't flinch. She nodded as if the signal had been expected. Then she lifted the Dallas Fed report she had just quoted from, held it up without fanfare, and said clearly and calmly, "Mr. Chair, I request unanimous consent to enter this survey into the record." There was a brief pause. The chair replied, "Without objection, so ordered." The paper made a soft sound as it landed back in her binder. An ordinary moment, bureaucratic even, but something about it felt final, not performative, not aggressive, just complete. The argument had been laid out in sequence. Her points had built like scaffolding, methodical, steady, unavoidable. And this last step wasn't a closing line. It was a timestamp, a permanent record. Wright nodded faintly, but the motion came late, delayed, as if his body was only now catching up with the speed at which the moment had passed him by. He reached for his water again. This time, as he lifted the cup, the camera caught it, the small, involuntary swallow. It wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. That single human tick told the audience more than a full paragraph of spin could ever manage. Because what had just unfolded wasn't a yelling match. It wasn't theater. It wasn't even a clash of ideologies. It was exposure. Exposure of cost, contradiction, and quiet complicity. And unlike most hearings, this one didn't fade into background noise. Not today, not after this. Online, the clip of AOC asking, "How does raising steel cost lower oil prices?" had already begun circulating. But it wasn't just the question. It was the silence that followed. The way the secretary blinked. The way she never rushed to fill the space. The way the Fed report landed like a ledger nobody wanted to balance. Subreddits began dissecting it frame by frame. Journalists clipped the moment her words ended, and the chair interjected, labeling it, "She had more." They just ran out of time. But everyone watching knew time had run out for Wright long before the gavel signaled it. AOC leaned back in her chair, her hands now resting calmly on the binder closed in front of her. No victory grin, no head shake, no celebratory tone. She didn't need it, because the power of her performance wasn't in her posture. It was in her precision. Wright, by contrast, looked like a man mid-step on a staircase that had suddenly vanished. His opening confidence, those measured phrases about reshoring, long-term strategy, market balance, had evaporated. In their place, a table covered in unaddressed data and a room that had grown steadily colder. The hearing would go on. Other members would ask their questions. Some would raise their voices. Some would offer praise, but the temperature had already been set, and every exchange that followed would unfold in the shadow of what had just occurred. Because while the clock may have run out on her time, the mic was still on, and America had already heard what it needed to hear. And so had Chris Wright. It started before she even left the hearing room. The first few missed calls popped up on the office line as AOC's staff watched the live stream from 2 blocks away. A scheduler turned to the comms assistant and said, "I think we're going to need more hands." 10 minutes later, voicemail storage was full. By the time she returned to her office, the outer desk phones were blinking nonstop, red lights flashing in rhythm like a pulse. A legislative aide picked up, only to hear a trembling voice from Dallas. "Please tell her thank you for saying our names out loud." The caller didn't leave her own name, just hung up quietly after a pause. That afternoon, the inbox ballooned past what filters could manage. Subject lines read like heartbeats. "I saw her. She spoke for us. My father was one of them." One email stood out. The sender line simply said, "Elena M. She was a mother in Texas. Her note typed with line breaks like spoken breath. I clean rooms at a hotel near Odessa. My husband works the rigs. He has TPS. He leaves at 5 a.m. and gets home after 8. We've been here since 2002. I never thought anyone in Congress would say our life out loud like that. You didn't have to, but you did. Gracias AOC read the message in silence. No reply yet. She just flagged it with a soft click and moved on. Then came the letter. A white envelope with blue ink and small, neat handwriting. No frills, no politics. Just paper and intention. A retired veteran from Kentucky. The note was handwritten. 3 paragraphs and every word pressed down with care. Congresswoman, I've disagreed with just about everything you've said over the years. I'm a Republican, a Marine, and proud of it. But yesterday, when you looked that guy in the eye and told him to remember who's working the fields, I remembered. My grandfather was one of those workers. Not in oil, but coal. West Virginia. Died of black lung when I was 9. Nobody said his name in D.C. either. I don't agree with your solutions, but I saw your spine, and I respect it. AOC folded the letter and slid it into the top drawer of her desk. No fanfare. No press release. Just a moment she wasn't going to forget. The interns were overwhelmed but wide-eyed. They logged messages from Mississippi, Colorado, Bakersfield, a union representative from Illinois, a 4th-grade teacher in Fresno who used the clip in her civics class, a high school student from Michigan who posted a TikTok of AOC's "If you don't know who's working the fields" line, overlaying it with images of his undocumented uncle welding in a helmet too big for his head. The story wasn't just being watched, it was being shared, re-narrated, translated. From energy hearings to kitchen tables, from political script to personal memory. In the middle of it all, someone brought AOC tea she never drank. The phone kept ringing. The screen kept buzzing. But what struck her most wasn't the volume. It was the clarity. Because when people reached out that day, they weren't asking for anything. They were just saying, I heard what you said. I saw you see us. And that was the kind of response no poll could measure, but every conscience could feel. By morning, the headlines had already sharpened their edges. Politico called it a surgical cross-examination wrapped in quiet fury. The Washington Post ran a front-page digital feature titled, "The 5 Minutes That Shook the Fossil Fuel Narrative." Cable networks looped the same clip on repeat. AO holding up the Dallas Fed report, her voice low and unwavering. Do you still believe the playing field is level? The sound bites hit fast, but it was the commentary that carried the weight. On MSNBC's Morning West, a panel of 4, all economists, none activists, played the footage in near silence before the host, a former GOP strategist, broke in. She didn't just ask questions, she delivered blows. Policy blows. The kind you can't walk off with a press release. By noon, the phrase had gone viral. Meanwhile, inside the Department of Energy's press office, the air was thick with damage control. Chris Wright's staff huddled over laptops and drafts, crafting language that sounded corrective without sounding panicked. A junior staffer suggested calling the Dallas Fed report non-binding, but was shot down instantly. Another proposed citing an internal memo on tariff balancing projections, but it hadn't been published yet, and they knew it wouldn't survive scrutiny. The safest route, they decided, was to deflect with future-facing rhetoric. The secretary remains committed to supporting American industry while ensuring affordability for all energy consumers. It landed with a dull thud. No one was convinced, least of all the reporters now flooding inboxes for comment. By early afternoon, conservative media outlets scrambled to reframe. On the Liberty Watch, a syndicated radio host tried to paint AOC's performance as emotion over expertise, but even his co-anchor winced when a caller asked, then why was she the only one quoting actual agency numbers? On a right-leaning panel show, a guest analyst suggested she was grandstanding for social media, only for the moderator to remind him the hearing wasn't live-streamed by her team, but by the House Oversight Committee. Even the usual critics were split. A columnist at the Federal Standard wrote somewhat reluctantly, I don't care for her politics, but she knew her facts. Wright didn't. Online, the response took on a momentum of its own. TikTok creators mashed her key lines with music. On Twitter, hashtags trended for hours. Hashtag she did her homework. Hashtag Wright was wrong. Hashtag subsidy showdown. On YouTube, independent political commentators, left and center, posted breakdown videos with titles like The Day AOC Took the Gloves Off and AOC vs. Fossil Logic, Who Really Won? But the most telling sign that the moment had broken containment came from the markets. Midday reports showed a subtle but measurable dip in oil infrastructure stocks, driven not by legislation, but by optics. Investors were watching, and they didn't like what they saw. A secretary under pressure, and a growing conversation that threatened to shift public understanding of subsidy economics. In the halls of Congress, colleagues from both sides acknowledged the impact, even if only in passing. One senator from a fossil-heavy state reportedly told her staff, "Say what you want about her, but she just made the secretary look like a guest in his own department." Back in AOC's office, the mood was steady, not triumphant, but grounded. They'd seen media storms before, some loud but fleeting, but this one felt different. It wasn't about a moment. It was about a narrative that had shifted, quietly, firmly, and on the record. And as her team sorted through press requests, op-ed invitations, and speech offers, AOC remained focused, not on the headlines, but on the people behind the numbers, the letters, the labor. The truth that had finally been spoken loud enough to hear. The news cycle raged, but AOC didn't lean into it. She didn't do the late-night shows. She didn't tweet the viral clips. Her team fielded press requests and politely declined most. While pundits dissected her every sentence from the hearing, she packed a bag and flew to New Mexico. There, beneath a wide, cloudless sky, stood the Red Mesa Wind Training Center, a modest cluster of buildings surrounded by towering turbines, their blades turning slow and steady like the breath of the land. It wasn't glamorous. No press pool, no podium, just scaffolding, hard hats, and the scent of warm copper in the air. She came not for a headline, but for a conversation. Inside the facility, a group of young trainees, most of them women, most of them Latina, were learning how to service the very machines that would someday power neighborhoods far beyond their hometowns. Some had GEDs. Others had left retail jobs, nursing homes, or construction crews. They wore work boots and safety vests, their hair tied back beneath white helmets marked with their initials in permanent marker. AOC didn't walk in with a speech. She walked in with questions. "How long's the training program?" she asked one young woman who introduced herself as Maribel. "What made you want to do this?" she asked another named Lucia, who shyly admitted her brother worked oil fields and she wanted something cleaner. They talked about line voltage, battery storage, and overtime pay, but also about fear. One student asked if it was true that funding for green programs might get cut again. Another wondered if people even believed in their work when politicians called it pipe dreams. AOC listened more than she spoke. When one of the instructors, a man who used to work in natural gas, mentioned that several graduates had been placed in projects up in Arizona, she nodded. "That's where impact is," she said softly. "Not just where you're trained, but where you're sent." As the visit wound down, the group gathered in a semicircle beneath the shadow of a turbine. It was late afternoon now. The blades above made a deep, rhythmic thrum. AOC looked at the women standing before her, sweat still clinging to their foreheads, dust on their sleeves, and said something that wasn't meant for sound bites. "Policy isn't made in the hearing," she told them. "It's made in the lives we touch." A quiet passed through the circle. She continued, "What you're doing here, this training, this leap of faith, it's not a headline, but it's what makes the headlines worth anything at all. Don't let anyone call you a footnote to someone else's industry. You are the future of it." They smiled, some sheepishly, others with a fire they hadn't quite had at the start of the day. Someone asked for a photo. She obliged, of course. But after she walked a few steps out into the field, the wind tugging gently at her blazer, and just stood there, alone with the turbines, with the dust, with the work that didn't fit into sound bites. Later that evening, while cable panels still debated her tone and tactics, AOC sat on a metal bench outside the training center. She checked her email. More letters from veterans, teachers, janitors. She responded to none of them that night. She just read and let the silence speak. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do in Washington is refuse to shout. And the most radical thing you can say is nothing at all. Only this: you showed up. I saw you. Now keep going. The office was quiet except for the soft clatter of keyboards and the occasional hum of a microwave reheating something forgotten. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and half-drunk coffee cups crowded the corners of desks like soldiers left standing after a long campaign. It was nearly midnight, but no one had mentioned the time. No one needed to. AOC sat cross-legged on a low couch, sneakers on, blazer tossed over the back of a nearby chair. Around her, 3 staffers worked from laptops and spiral-bound notebooks, their sleeves rolled up and eyes red from reading too much fine print. The room wasn't grand, just a modest corner of Capitol Hill rented for functionality, not optics. There were no framed photographs of historic votes, no polished wood furniture, just whiteboards filled with arrows, question marks, and acronyms. On one of the desks lay a pile of federal reports, budget appendices, tax code excerpts, industry lease maps. Pages were tabbed with neon flags, color-coded with labels like indirect subsidy, land lease loophole, and Fed survey. One document had been reprinted 3 times because someone kept highlighting different lines. AOC sipped from a mug that had long since gone cold. "Run it again," she said. "Start from the top." Ben, her energy advisor, looked up from his notes. "Okay, he'll start with fossil fuels don't receive meaningful subsidies. Wants to sound measured." AOC nodded, eyes fixed. "And I'll ask him to define meaningful. Then follow with leasing figures and tax write-offs. Don't let him pivot." "Right," said Maya, the legislative aide sitting across from her, typing without looking up. "And when he brings up partnerships, we transition to military logistics. Use language that doesn't sound radical, just clear." They had rehearsed this not once, but 6 times. Each time they changed something. A statistic, a lead-in, a counter-question designed not to shock, but to disarm. And yet, through it all, AOC didn't talk about winning. Not once. "We don't need viral," she said as she slid a printed quote into her folder. "We need clarity." The team nodded. It was a phrase she had repeated all year. Clarity, not clout. Truth, not noise. Because viral moments fade. But a well-placed fact, delivered with composure, that could dig roots. Jason, her youngest staffer, leaned back in his chair. "You want to go after the steel tariffs tomorrow too?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, "but not to catch him off guard. We bring the numbers, bring the logic, and ask the question the public's been living without answers for. How does raising costs lead to lowering prices?" Jason grinned. "You know he's not going to answer that." "I'm not asking him to," AOC replied. "I'm asking the American people to notice that he didn't." That line hung in the air. Not dramatic, just matter of fact, like everything else they'd built for this moment. A few minutes later, someone offered to order food. Pizza or Thai, no one could agree. Maya suggested just getting protein bars from the drawer and powering through. No one objected, no one complained. Because this wasn't a team built on adrenaline. It was built on purpose. Not a scramble for a soundbite, but a strategy born of late nights, unpaid internships, and the collective memory of being ignored. Every question they wrote came from someone who couldn't be in that room. Someone working a shift, riding a bus home, or holding a second job just to keep the lights on. When they wrapped at 1:12 a.m., AOC stood, stretched her back, and stacked the papers in order by color tab. She looked at her team, their eyes heavy but their focus intact, and said only one thing before grabbing her blazer and heading for the door. "Tomorrow isn't about him. It's about who's watching." And in that quiet office, surrounded by charts and grit, they understood exactly what that meant. She was 10 years old, seated at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes in front of her. The room smelled faintly of arroz con gandules, and the window fan buzzed with the rhythm of a Bronx summer night. Her father sat beside her, still in his work shirt, the collar damp from the long day. He slid a utility bill across the table like it was a puzzle she could solve. "Start here," he said, pointing to the column labeled usage. Alexandria squinted at the numbers. They didn't mean much then, just kilowatt hours and base charges, things most kids never needed to learn. But her father insisted. He took a pencil and underlined 3 lines: usage, rate, and delivery fee. "This," he said, tapping the paper gently, "is how they talk to you without ever knocking on your door." She looked at him, unsure what he meant. "If you understand where the money goes," he said, "you understand who they care about." That line stuck. It wasn't delivered with fanfare. It wasn't meant to be profound. But in a 2-bedroom apartment where late bills were folded quietly into drawers and lights flickered more than they should, that kind of knowledge mattered. It meant control, at least over understanding, if not the system itself. She learned to track which months the heat rose, how winter inflated numbers that weren't just numbers, but decisions: groceries or gas, medicine or electric. Her father showed her how to read past the logo, past the friendly font, how to follow the flow of money upstream until you found the people making decisions they never had to live under. Years later, that memory still sat with her at every hearing. When Chris Wright spoke in abstractions, market dynamics, resilience investments, supply volatility, she thought of that kitchen table. She thought of her father holding a bill in one hand and a worn calculator in the other. Not as a civics lesson, but as a survival ritual. She thought of how hard it was for someone like him to find a voice in a room like this. So when she pressed right for numbers, not projections, not promises, but real dollar impacts, she wasn't grandstanding. She was translating, turning the language of power back into the language of the people it affected. She wasn't interested in sound bites. She was interested in the parts of the system that bill you quietly and hope you never ask why. That's why she brought spreadsheets to the hearing, not slogans. That's why she interrupted politely but firmly. That's why she asked the question twice when the first answer tried to slip away. Because she knew if no one followed the money, no one would be held accountable for where it went. Sometimes she still heard her father's voice when she scanned reports late at night. "Track the delivery fee, mija," he would say. "That's where they hide things." She smiled at the thought, how he'd probably laugh at her now, sitting behind a congressional desk with the same stare she once gave that utility bill. But she carried his words with her, not as memory, but as method. Because at the end of the day, hearings weren't just for show, they were a ledger, and she intended to balance it, not with clever rhetoric, but with the quiet, persistent math her father taught her. If you understand where the money goes, you understand who they care about. And if you ask the right questions, loud enough, long enough, clear enough, eventually the people in charge might have to answer, not just on paper, but out loud. Back in the hearing room, the light above her microphone glowed red. The nameplate in front of her read, "Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez," but she didn't need it. Everyone in the room already knew who she was. She gripped the folder tighter, not out of nerves, but focus. The thick binder with color-coded tabs and handwritten notes in the margins wasn't just paperwork. It was a blueprint, a weapon sharpened by long nights and harder truths. Each page represented not just data, but intention. Each highlight reminded her of someone she'd met who could never sit at this table, but whose life was shaped by what was decided here. Across the dais, Chris Wright adjusted his tie again. The space between them was only a few feet, but in that moment it felt like the width of 2 completely different Americas. A staffer seated behind her leaned toward another and whispered, barely audible over the shuffle of paper and the hum of C-SPAN's quiet cameras. "This might be the one people remember." They were right. The room was steady, but the energy had shifted. She asked her first question, not with force, but with precision. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Each word was measured, like walking a line she knew by heart. She brought up fossil fuel subsidies, not as an accusation, but as arithmetic. She read from budget line items the way someone might read a ledger of unpaid debts. When Wright tried to blur definitions, she didn't push back with volume. She simply clarified, with numbers, with source citations, with the calm of someone who already knew the answer. When she introduced the letter from Jose, the pipeline worker from Oklahoma, she didn't raise her voice. She let his words do the lifting. And when she asked the secretary if he supported ending work permits for people like Jose, legal, documented, essential, she didn't blink as the silence stretched. And when she folded the Dallas Fed report back into her binder, after reading aloud how steel tariffs were strangling the very industry he claimed to protect. She didn't flinch when time expired. She simply requested to enter it into the record, making sure the moment couldn't be forgotten. She was prepared, but more than that, she was exact. Because preparation means knowing what you want to say, but precision means knowing what people need to hear. Every glance she gave was controlled. Every pause allowed the weight of her words to settle. She didn't argue for applause. She argued for memory, for record, for the kind of truth that doesn't trend, but lasts. At one point, a reporter in the back row scribbled a note in all caps. "She isn't performing. She's building something." The hearing ran long that day, but time felt secondary. Something about her tone, anchored but never theatrical, reminded people what these hearings were supposed to be: public service, not public spectacle. And later, when the transcripts were read, when the clips were shared, when headlines tried to distill it into one viral moment, none could quite capture what happened in real time. Because this wasn't about a viral clip, it was about a shift in what it means to lead with facts and still speak to people's lives, a shift in how power listens or fails to, and how truth finds its way through anyway. So when the intern whispered, "This might be the one people remember," it wasn't prophecy, it was documentation. Because by the time she closed her folder and leaned back, the work had already been done. And yes, this was the one. When Chris Wright returned to testify months later, he came armed with more than talking points. His binder was thicker. His answers were more rehearsed. His staff had run mock hearings for days, feeding him policy nuance, subsidy distinctions, tariff footnotes. He was prepped to the teeth. And yet, the tone had shifted. He didn't speak with the same confident ease he'd carried into that first hearing. His phrasing was cautious now, not casual. When asked about cost burdens and industrial inputs, he didn't deflect. He cited the Dallas Fed report, by name. And when a member of the committee raised the issue of work authorization and labor stability, he paused and said, "As Representative Ocasio-Cortez highlighted in a previous hearing, many of the workers sustaining this sector operate under complex legal frameworks. It's something we're now reviewing." No fireworks, no headlines, just a crack in the dam. In committee briefings, small but meaningful revisions started to circulate. Language tightening the oversight of leasing rates, draft proposals to reassess indirect subsidies, and a quiet note passed between two aides that read, "Her numbers changed the room." The change wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but it was real, because something had been shaken loose, not just in one witness chair, but in the culture of avoidance that usually defined them. Wright didn't have to name her directly again. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room remembered. The chair he sat in no longer felt like a seat of control. It felt like a witness box. And even though AOC wasn't present that day, her name still echoed between every question. Not as opposition, but as calibration. The mic wasn't on, but her impact still was. The envelope came in late. No return address, just a first name and a zip code scrawled in careful handwriting. Inside was a folded note and a photo of two brothers standing in front of a gas station in Amarillo. One wore a work uniform, the other wore a soft, tired smile. "My brother lost his permit 2 months ago. He'd been here 17 years. We thought no one cared. Your words gave us hope." AOC read it quietly in her office, then slid the photo into her planner, between the pages she used for testimony prep and site visits. A week later, her office received an email from a high school debate coach in Flagstaff. The subject line read, "Teaching Courage." The message was simple. His students had used her exchange with Chris Wright to model cross-examination techniques. They had watched it 10 times. One student said it was the first time she saw a woman fight with facts and not flinch. They sent a photo too. 7 teenagers huddled around a laptop, notebooks in hand, hands mid-gesture, eyes wide with purpose. And then came the package. No press release, no announcement, just a small wooden plaque from a clean energy startup in Vermont. Laser etched across the grain, "For the receipts." No explanation needed. They knew. She knew. Not every ripple becomes a wave. But these moments, quiet, precise, personal, were proof that the hearing didn't end when the gavel fell. It carried forward in letters, in students, in hands building turbines out in fields she'd never stepped foot in, and that, she thought, was the point, to speak so clearly that others could carry the echo without needing permission. As AOC steps out onto the marble Capitol steps, the air is heavy with the echo of unfinished stories. A few reporters linger nearby, but she doesn't stop for the cameras. She walks steadily, binder in hand, coat draped over her arm, the evening sun casting long shadows behind her. And then her voice rises. Not from her mouth, but through the memory of the moment. The mic wasn't loud because I shouted. It was loud because the silence had lasted too long. If they forget who built the grid, we'll remind them. If they try to bury the truth, we'll be the echo. Because policy doesn't begin in marble halls. It begins in laundromats, break rooms, bus stops, in the places they don't think we notice. But we notice. And now, we're speaking. The screen fades, but the sound lingers. Boots on stone, calm and unafraid. AOC stops at the top step. She turns back, looks directly at the camera. No smile, just clarity. Then she turns again and walks back inside, not to finish something, but to begin the next round. This story isn't just about a hearing. It's about the quiet power of showing up prepared, speaking plainly, and honoring the people often left out of policy conversations. AOC didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. By connecting numbers to names, facts to faces, she reminded us that real accountability doesn't always roar. It sometimes just refuses to blink. The most powerful mic isn't the one wired to go viral. It's the one that amplifies those who've been silenced longest. And that's where true leadership lives. Not in sound bites, but in clarity, consistency, and care. Question for you. When was the last time someone spoke up for you when you couldn't? And when have you done that for someone else? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.